Today, we're going to briefly discuss ethics in biology. Obviously, there are many ethical issues we could consider, but to organize our thinking, we're going to explore one main idea from each of the core philosophies we use to think about ethical dilemmas. Virtue ethics, which thinks about moral agents, motivation, and character. Deontology, which considers responsibility and intrinsic goodness. And consequentialism, which considers an action's effects on others. Let's begin with consequentialism. This is the philosophy that says when we face an ethical decision, we should try to account for its effects on moral patients, that is, anyone or anything that deserves moral consideration. Typically, we measure these effects by the pleasure and pain they create. We aim to create the greatest pleasure for the greatest number of moral patients. From the perspective of biology, the most pressing question is how we treat animals in our quest for knowledge. If we're faced with a dilemma that will create pain in one neutral person, but alleviate an equal amount of pain in 5 other neutral individuals, then the math is relatively simple. But to measure pleasure and pain, we must agree that a unit of pleasure is equal on both sides of the equation. So, when we consider members of different species, we must ask, is the pain of one animal equivalent to the pain of another animal? If we cause negative 10 units of pain in one chimp to create 2 units of pleasure in 5 humans, is this a sum-zero equation? Generally speaking, humans tend to think of chimps as almost morally equivalent to themselves, so maybe we say the ratio is something like 2 to 1, that we can cause negative 20 units of pain in a chimp to create a total of 10 units of human pleasure. But what about mice? Maybe you feel that we could kill 50 mice if it meant we would save 1 human, so there might be something like a 5,000 to 1 ratio. But is there a number of mice that becomes too many for us to kill? Most of our unquestioned assumptions about this reflect a rather unscientific chain of being that puts humans on the top of a model of complexity, and then sprinkles other animals along that chain based on traits like intelligence, our ability to read their emotions, usefulness, even cuteness. But how ethical is this hierarchy? Would you kill 1,000 lizards to save 1 human? Or could we invert it? Would you kill 1 human to save 1,000 lizards? At the very least, we should challenge the way we construct this hierarchy and the way that we think about whose pain matters and why. Another way to consider how we should interact with our environment is through deontology, the philosophy of responsibility. According to a strong version of this theory, we have a responsibility to uphold principles like justice or fairness, autonomy or a person's ability to choose, and beneficence non-malevolence, or the responsibility to do good and not cause harm. In biology, we should extend these questions not only to human subjects, but to the world around us as well. What is our obligation to a tree, to a forest, to an ecosystem? Deontology is a philosophy of logical principles and rules. If we accept the logic of evolution, how does that affect our responsibilities around invasive species? On the one hand, if we have an obligation not to interfere in an ecosystem's evolution, perhaps that encourages us to exercise caution around human interference in that ecosystem, through development or genetic testing or how we interact with an animal or plant population. On the other hand, if we extend that principle of non-interference, we might also question our right to determine which species is invasive, and instead consider them simply better adapted to a changing environment. This poses some real quandaries for us when we consider endangered, charismatic megafauna who are struggling to adapt to changing environments. Finally, as we think about our interactions with the natural world, we should consider the kind of character we want to build. Virtue ethics encourages us to cultivate positive traits and values in ourselves so that we might ask, what would a good biologist do? In other words, what kind of scientist do we want to be? An easy example of how this philosophy has made change for arguably the better in the field of biology is vivisection, the practice of dissecting an animal while it is still alive. While this was common in science through the 19th century, toward the 1800s, scientists began to question whether biologists wanted to be the kind of people who inflicted that pain on animals. Even if the ultimate payoffs were acceptable, or the principles were sound, virtue ethics suggested that to perform a vivisection implied a questionable character. As we move into an era of exciting biotechnology, genetics, and other scientific developments, virtue ethics encourages us not to lose sight of the traits that make us the kinds of scientists that we want to be. Of course, there are many nuances to each of these arguments and more discussions to be had. but hopefully, this gets you thinking about what kinds of effects you want your science to have, which principles you want to uphold, and the kind of scientist that you want to become.